After wishing you a Shavua Tov, we're going to discuss a case of Chamoso in Mima'enes. So let's just review. The Mishnah tells us, Iyata yochel lomer bechamoso, b'yem chamiv, shenimtzu islandis o shemiana. The Mishnah tells us that it's impossible to come up with a scenario of miun with regard to all the arayos of chamoso, because chamoso by definition means that Reuven married the daughter of Sarah, and Sarah therefore is his mother-in-law, who, if she's married to Shimon, now falls for even with the death of Shimon. But it's impossible for her, meaning Sarah in this case, who's chamoso, to be Mima'enes, because miyun only applies to Kedusha Ktana. And in the case of chamoso, she cannot be a Ktana because she gave birth. In fact, Reuven is married to her daughter. So in any case of a mother-in-law, or the mother of a mother-in-law, or Aim Chamiv, all these cases, by definition, are talking about women who gave birth. And the Yavam married the daughter of this woman, who's now his mother-in-law, etc. How could that be? It's impossible, says the Mishnah, to be Mima'enes because a Ketana cannot give birth. Hiksha Aruch Laner. Here we have a kasha of the Aruch Laner. He wants to come up with a scenario in which you could have chamoso mima'enes. So if you have page test, you'll see it on the right column, the second major paragraph, where it says sham. Okay, so we're now studying a scenario, a case that was constructed by the Aruch Laner. What's the case? Nasa achiv isha bekatnusa. So that Shimon marries Sarah and she's a Ketana. And Shimon marries another woman. We'll call her Rivka. So Shimon is married to Sarah and to Rivka. Umiana bo Ktanazu. And Sarah was Mima'enes, as any Ketana can, and she walks out of the marriage to Shimon. Achar kach higdila. Now Sarah becomes mature. V'nisa li'acher, and she marries someone else. V'yodalo bas, and now that she's a gedola and she got married, she can certainly mother a child. In this case, a girl. V'nasahu es bita, and he married her daughter. So now we're talking about Reuven marrying the daughter of Sarah. Sarah was a Ketana who was married to his brother Shimon. She was Mima'enes to Shimon. When she grew older and matured, she married someone else, had a child by the name of Sarah, and Reuven was married to Sarah. The Achkach Meis Achiv. And now Shimon dies, and now the Mishnah fits beautifully into place. Why? I mean, the scenario of the Mishnah. What doesn't fit into place is that the Mishnah says it's impossible. Shimon dies without children. Reuven is going to be miyabim, the wife of his brother's late brother Shimon. The afsha hoisa be'avar tzarasa shel chamosa. Now, this woman who's married to Shimon and falls for even to Reuven, her name is Rivka. Rivka was once a tzara to Sarah, and Sarah is none other than Reuven's mother-in-law, because Reuven married the daughter of Sarah when Sarah grew older, and she, after her meeting to Shimon, she married some so-and-so, whoever it might be. And Sarah was the was the mother of a girl who Reuven married. So now when Sarah in another marriage has a daughter and Reuven marries that daughter, Sarah is now the mother-in-law of Reuven. Now Sarah's not falling for Yibum because Mizman, long ago, she was Mema Enes and Shimon. So she's out of the picture. But before she was Mema Enes, she was at Sarah to Rivka, both with sorrows to Shimon. When Shimon dies, Rivka is the Tzara of Chamosa. And the Chiddush of that Mishnah is that Rivka is not Ptura mi Yibum, she's in the parsha of Yibum. And why is she Misyabemes? Even though she's a Tzara to Reuven's mother-in-law, but the answer is that Reuven's mother-in-law, Sarah, as a Ketana, was Mima Enes. Which means that at the moment that Shimon died, Rivka was not at Sarah to Sarah because Sarah had long exited from this marriage to Shimon through Yibam when she was a Ketana. So that even though Sarah is Reuven's mother-in-law, and at the moment that before, let's say the moment before Miyun, if we could freeze that moment in time, at that moment, Sarah was a Sarah to Rivka. Again, this is way before Sarah became Reuven's mother-in-law because Sarah's a Ketana at that point. But nevertheless, they still both Sarahs to Shimon. So when Shimon dies, Rivka, his other wife, falling to Yibum to Reuven, is at Sarah of Chamoso. Now, why is she at Sarah of Chamoso? Because Reuven married the daughter of Sarah. Now, don't tell me, okay, he married the daughter of Sarah way later on. After Sarah became a Gdola, she had already been Enes to his brother Shimon. She married someone else, and then she mothered a child who got married, and this daughter got married to Reuven. But nevertheless, you can't deny that at the moment that Shimon dies, the status of Sarah is that Sarah vis-a-vis Reuven is a mother-in-law. I mean, if Shimon would have a relationship with Sarah, that would be a violation of a very severe erev of Chamotz. We'll see soon how severe it is. And this woman, Sarah, who's Chamosa of Reuven, was the Sarah of Rivka, who is the wife of the late Shimon who died. So that the Orach Laner, L'chora, at face glance, seemingly has successfully created a scenario in which the Miyun is going to save the Tsaras Erev, the Tsaras Chamos. Why? Because although this Chamosa was a Ketana at the time she was married to Shimon, and therefore Rivka was a Sarah to Sarah at the time when Sarah was a Ketana, but nevertheless, Sarah went ahead and was Mima Enes. And that Miyud is effective to completely negate the status of Rivka as a Tsar Serva. It's almost, if you want to put it this way, I don't know if you have to say this, but it's almost as if Mian works Lamafreya retroactively. Just like we have the case of Islanders, which the Mishnah points out is impossible in Chamoso because an islandess cannot give birth. And we said that an islandess, according to Rashi and Tosfos, is a Mekach Tos. So when you talk about an islandess who is a Tsara, who is an Erva, and she has a Tsara, well, guess what? The islandess was never married to Shimon, and therefore the Tsara was never a Tsara's Erva. Here too. In the case of Miyun, the Miyun operates to remove the Ishus as if there never was Ishus. Which means that Rivka, who's the Tsara, who was at one point the Tsara of Sarah, is not really the Tsara of Sarah at all. Because Sarah, in so far as she delivered Miyun to Shimon, is completely out of the picture. So we see that Saras Chamoso will be impacted by the power and the efficacy of miyun. Why does the Mishnah exclude any possibility of chamoso mima'enes? Mishnah is assuming that if she's chamoso, she gave birth to a child, and therefore she couldn't possibly be ketana. How could there be miyun? But the answer is there could be miyun while she was a ketana. Later she became chamoso. So at the time that Shimon died, Shimon's wife is now a tzoras erva, meaning a tzara of chamoso, although she was chamoso in an earlier stage of her marriage to Shimon when she was a ketana, and then she subsequently was mima'enes. And then the Mishnah would be telling me a chiddush that the power and the impact of miyun is such that it removes the status of tzoras erva, and therefore the tzara, meaning Rivka, will be misyaven. Says the Aruch LaNer, Zu ena tzoras erva klal. This case is radically different, fundamentally, than all the other cases of tzoras erva, meaning I'm going to prove to you logically that this case could not fit the bill of tzoras erva, and that there couldn't even be a havamina that the tzara of an erva in this scenario would not fall for yibum. It's not a tzoras erva at all. Why? He says the following, that in order to be a tzoras erva, that erva relationship has to sync, it has to coincide time-wise with the tzara relationship. So there's a tzara relationship to an erva. So when two women share the same husband, and one of those two women is an erva to Reuven, that's called a tzoras erva. But if you have a case where a woman becomes an erva later in life, past the state of tzara, meaning after the marriage which she shared with another husband, with her husband, was gone already, that's not a tzoras erva. By the time that this woman Sarah became the mother-in-law, the erva to Reuven, they're not married to each other. You have to have one moment in time where this woman is first and foremost an erva. Number two, she's a tzara. Here, we're constructing a scenario in which she became an erva later when they weren't tzaras at all. So you don't have an overlap of number one, erva, number two, tzara. They weren't tzara zulazu when she was an erva, so therefore the tzara is not a tzaras erva. Hidush HaMishnah, Miyun Matir, when the Mishnah comes along to say that Miyun removes the erva situation and is Matir b'tzara, Eino nitzrach el b'tzara shahoisa zman misuyam tzaras erva. When you have a tzara that was at one moment in a time a tzaras erva, then the Mishnah wants to be mechadish that Miyun removes her status as a tzaras erva. But here she was not an erva at the time that they were tzaras. In other words, that they were tzaros to each other. One was an erva, but she was mima'enes. And therefore, b'shas misabal, she's no longer a tzara of an erva. That's the chiddush of Miyun. That Miyun removes that relationship in such a way that at the time of the mitzvah of Shimon, they aren't tzaros zulus. But they were tzaros during the time that she was an erva, that tzara was in. So this was, I think, a very beautiful presentation of the Aruch. Okay. Now we go on to a chiddush of Rabbi Chanan Vaser, the Kovetz Ha'aretz. And hopefully we will be able to identify with this finish based on what we learned last week. Kishem shetzaras bito p'tura, kach tzaras tzarasa p'tura. So we say that there's a halach of tzara, and then there's a halach of tzaras tzara. And that's going to force us to introduce not only Shimon into the picture who dies without a child, but Levi as well. And that's going to introduce tzaras tzara. So Rashi says the following. Tzaras bito, tura, af benefila shnia, b'misas ha'ach hashem. Mishum shebenefila rishona b'misas ach harishon niftera mishum tzaras erba. B'nesra b'eshes av. B'kaimalon shekol Yevamot shenesra ala Yavam b'shas nefila rei nasis keshes ach sheyesh lo banim v'asura hi liolam v'afilu b'nefila acher. Rashi is going to explain that tzaras tzara, whose p'tura min ha'yibum, says the Mishnah, is built on the mechanics of kevon sha'asura lav b'shas nefila asura olav li'olam. That if a woman could not fall for yibum at the moment of nefila, which means the moment that Shimon died, then she's asura li'olam, meaning she goes back to be an Eishes Ach. The Torah allowed was matir the erev of Eishes Ach for the sake of the mitzvah of Yibum, but if at the time of the Nefil Yibum she was an erev and therefore she couldn't fall for Yibum, now she goes back into the state of Eishes Ach. And this is how Rashi interprets the halacha of tzaras tzara. That since in the first round of Shimon dying and there was an appeal for Yibum to Reuven, this woman was a tzara of Bito, meaning that Shimon had been married to the daughter of Reuven plus another wife, and that other wife is a tzaras erva. Now what happens is that tzaras erva gets married to Levi. Levi dies and has, in addition to this tzaras erva, another wife who's tzaras tzara, and these two wives fall to Reuven. Says Rashi that the reason why the tzaras tzara is considered tzaras erva is because since the tzaras erva, at the time that Shimon died and she fell for Yibum to Reuven, she was the tzara of an erva to Reuven. She was a second wife to the daughter of Reuven. She, that second wife, which is a tzaras erva, now becomes an erva. So that now when Levi marries the tzara of an erva plus another woman, that tzaras erva has the status of an erva. And why is that? Because Rashi inflects, or I should say Rashi invokes the principle of Yevama shenesal ayov b'shas nefila nases keshes ish v'asura olav li'olam. Since the tzara of Bas Reuven, when Shimon died and left these two women, the daughter of Reuven and another wife, that other wife is now considered Eishes Achar, because when she falls for Yibum to Reuven as a result of the fact that she's a tzaras erva, she herself is a tzara, is out of the picture of Yibum. Once she's out of the picture of Yibum, she goes back to being Eishes Ach. So there's an erva relationship to that tzaras bito between her and Reuven. Why? Because since the tzara is married to Reuven's brother Shimon, and Shimon sets up an erva on that tzara called Eishes Ach, meaning the woman who's married to Shimon and does not fall for Yibum is Eishes Ach of Reuven. Is that correct? Now, when she gets married to Levi, And again, Levi has no problem in being the Avimah because Bito of Reuven is not related in any way to Levi. So the second wife who's sharing that erva of Reuven is in no way related to Levi. So when Levi marries this Tsaras erva, vis-a-vis Reuven, since the Tsaras erva on the first round when Shimon died could not fall for Yibum, says Rashi, therefore she becomes an erva of Eishes Ach. And when Levi dies, she will now pater a Patzara, who's a Tsaras Tzara. Niramidvara, what do we derive from this Rashi? Shalule Aklam, if not for this principle that Rashi invokes, that she was Nesra of B'Shas Yibum, and therefore there's never going to be a heter, she becomes an Eishes. Lo hoya siba lesar es tzoras bito b'nefila shniya. There's no other reason why the tzara of bito should be asura when she's married to Levi. Right? So Levi, one second. Lesar tzoras bito b'nefila. Oh, meaning if Shimon is married to Tzoras Bito of Reuven and another woman, that woman whose Tzoras Bito could only generate a Ptur Yibum in the next Nefila in Levi only because of this principle that makes her into an Eishes Ach, meaning she fell for Yibum on the first Nefila from Shimon when he died, and vis-a-vis Reuven, she was a Tzoras Erba, Tzoras Bito. Now she becomes Eishes Ach, and that's the reason, and the only reason apparently why when she marries Levi together with another woman, she packs up the other woman, the Tzoras Tzara. Sharelo Haisa Tzoras Bito Ella Eitzel Ha'acharisha. The logic of Rashi is very compelling. What was the status of Tzoras Bito vis-a-vis Levi? As far as Levi is concerned, she's not a Tzoras Erva. Right? She's a Tzoras Erva within the context of Shimon's dying, Shimon's Nefila for Yibum, which falls in front of Reuven. But now we introduce Levi into the picture. And as far as Levi is concerned, she was never Tzoras Erva. Or Raya Levi went ahead and married her, which he was allowed to do. He gets a big mitzvah, big applause for that. So what that means is that the so-called Tzoras Erva, the Tzoras Bito, at the moment of Levi's death, is not a Tzoras Erva at all. Because we're talking about a marriage of Levi. And in the context of the marriage of Levi, Levi married a woman who was never Tzoras Erva as far as he's concerned. So why is a Tzoras Erva Asura on Levi? The only answer is because Hol V'Nesra of B'Shas Nefila, she could not fall for Yibum on the previous Nefila, meaning when Shimon died, therefore she becomes Eishes Ach. So Tzoras Erva is Eishes Ach. Rebbe Chanan, and he says that's not right. We're not learning Rashi properly. We're not interpreting Rashi the right way. Why is the Tzoras Bito Asura B'Nefila Shniya? Mishum shetzara b'makom erva kaima. She gets a status of a tzoras erva. that status itself excludes her from Yibum. We say that an erva is excluded from Yibum, and let's say we derive from Achos Ishta. No, we're saying that Saras erva is asura for Yibum. And that's derived from Litzrar, if you remember the extra H. So Tsaras Erva now has her own independent status of an Erva. Mitzad Atz. Shemo HaErva B'Atzmo. She has the same identical status as the Erva herself. In other words, we don't have to introduce Eishes Achi. Forget about Eishes Achi. She's a Tsaras Erva. It's I will call it the law of contagious diseases, that the erva now, through contagion, she pollutes and contaminates her tzara. And she rubs off on her tzara. Tzara now becomes an erva. That's the category called tzaras erva, says Rabbi Khan. So now when Shimon died, she, the tzara of the erva, gains the status of an erva. Shuv einahu poker mimena liola. Her status as an erva is never removed. Aflo liachar shekfar einon tsaros zuluzu. Even if, let's say, the erva herself is out of the picture, like for example, when Levi marries the tsaras erva. When Levi marries the tsaras erva, she's not a tsara to an erva. So why is she going to pater up Levi's other wife, who's a tsaras tzara? The answer is because the tsaras erva is in and of herself. Inherently, she is an erva. The new category of tsaras erva is a new subcategory of erva, gives the shame erva, and that shame erva is never removed, even when she's no longer a tsaras erva. Like, for example, let's say a tsaras erva, the erva would die. So she's still a tsaras erva. Why? Because she was a tsaras erva, the shas nefila. The nefila of Shimon, when he had two wives, one of whom was the daughter of Reuven, and the other was a tzara. That critical moment of the death of Shimon, which is called the nefila rishona, generates the status of the tsaras erva of that of an erva. She's exactly like an erva. And in the context of that relationship, when Levi dies and he leaves the tsaras erva together with the tsaras erva, the tsaras tzara is now a tzara of an erva, because the tsaras erva is an erva by virtue of the first nefila. The first nefila, actually, you know what I mean? It's almost like you could say there's a certain reality, and then there's a legal reality that attaches to the reality. The reality is that when Shimon died, this woman was a tsaras erva. You can't deny that. The halacha, the legal element, comes in to the picture, now says that if the mitzias you were a tsaras erva, because within the context of falling for Yibum to Reuven, you were the tzara of Reuven's daughter. Therefore, you are an erva. And that's a brand new status of an erva. So the relationship between Reuven and the second wife of Shimon is that of an erva, b'toras tzaras erva. And it always remains a tzaras erva. This has nothing to do with a halacha that since b'shas nefila there was no Yibum, therefore we introduced the erva of Eishes Ach. That's not what Rashi has in mind. Now let's figure out the language of Rashi. Masha Hosef Rashi Shemidin Hoil the Nesra Asura Hatzara B'Nefila Shniya. Eino Elo L'Makom Shebeintayim Hudra Ha'erva Ukegon V'Achotz Ishto Shehutra Li'achra Nefila Rishona Al Yidei Misas Ishto Sharei Tzaras Ahoysa Amura Lios Teres Miyaka Shehutra Erva. Wow, this is amazing. Rabbi Chanan says that Rashi was compelled to invoke the principle of Hov and Nesra, Shas Nefilah, etc. Because of the following scenario. The status of the Tsaras Erva was that she was a Tsara of Achos Ishta, meaning Shimon and Reuven were married to two sisters. Shimon has another wife, besides the sister of Reuven's wife, who's a Tsaras Erva. Now what happens is that after Shimon dies, Levi marries the wife of Shimon, who was an erva to Reuven because she was achos ishto of Reuven, and then after Levi marries this woman, and he marries another woman. So again, he's marrying the tzara of achos ishto. At that moment, achos ishto dies, and now Rashi has a problem. Why? Because when achos ishto dies, the tsaras erva now is no longer a tsaras erva. When Levi dies, we don't have a mitzius of tsaras erva. So how can you now establish a tsaras erva status that's going to even pater up Hatzara, who's the tsaras tzara? That's Rashi. Meaning the following. Yochanan says the logic that we suggested is absolutely ironclad. If at the moment of the tefillah this woman is a tsaras erva, she takes on the status of an erva unto herself, independent status of erva. However, what happens if at the time of the tefillah we don't have an erva? The entire status of tsaras erva as an erva is a disease. How do you say in the nifal? How do you say that was contagion by? No, I don't know what word. That was she was infected. I'll use that term by the fact that she was a tzara of an erva. But now the erva is out of the picture. If the tsaras erva status as an erva is a result of the fact that she is a tzara to an erva, if that erva is no longer in the world at the time that Levi dies, because before Levi died, the sister of Reuven's wife had died. So at that point, the other wife of Levi is not a tzara to a tsaras erva, because the tsaras erva relationship in terms of the context of Levi's nefilah when he dies is no longer in the Welt. It's no longer in existence. He's not married to achos ishto. So if this woman is the tzara of achos ishto, and we're giving her the status of an erva because she's a tzara of an erva, well, that erva no longer exists. So at the moment that Levi dies, that tzara could not be considered a tsaras erva, and therefore she couldn't pater up Levi's other wife, the tsaras tzara. That's the problem that Rashi faces. So that again, we're working within the framework of our definition that tsaras erva has a shem erva. But again, that shem erva depends upon the fact, the reality, the mitzvah, that she is a tzara to an erva. If achos ishto dies, then there's no longer an erva relationship. There's no longer, therefore, tsaras erva. So Rashi has to come to grips with that scenario, with that problem. Therefore, says Rashi, al zeh kosav Rashi she'ena erva v'tzarasa nitaros al yidei misas ishto. Why don't we apply the logic that the tsaras erva is no longer a tsaras erva, meaning she's no longer an erva because there's no achos ishto. Shum hoil v'nesra sha'achas asura olav olavis. Here we have no choice. We are compelled to introduce the erva of Eishes Ah. And since at the time of the nefilah of Shimon, this woman was a tzara to achos ishto of Reuven. Now, at that moment of Shimon's death, she was an erva to Reuven. She doesn't fall for even to Reuven. And now Rashi says we have this principle that she becomes an Eishes Ach. Once she's in the category of the Erev of Eishes Ach, that category can never be removed, as we know. And therefore, Tsaras Ereva, even after Levi dies, will still pater up with Tsaras. And now we want to study the Prima God. This is on the left column. By the way, on the bottom right, he has a Rabbeinu Yerucham that makes no sense. I can't deal with it. But on the top left, he has a sefer called the Paras Yosef by the same author of the Prima God, who is a very known lamdan in the yeshiva world. The Gemara says the following: in the seder, the sequence of the 15 arayos in our Mishnah, Bito comes first, and the Gemara is upset about it. The Gemara argues that Achos Ishto should be first. Why? Because we derive the halach of Tsaras Ereva, who's Ptura ben Ayibum, from Achos Ishto. And since the subject of our Mishnah is that these 15 categories of arayos pater up that Tzara, we should be mentioning Achos Ishto first on the list because she is the Malamed, she is the context in the Torah from which we derive the tour of Tsaras Ereva. And that's derived from the pasuk Isha lachoso lo tikach Isha lachoso litzra. Litzra means the tzara of Achos Ishto. So Achos Ishto should be first on the list. That's the Gemara's catch. Now the Pri Megadim is going to try to prove that with regard to the question of from whence do we derive, what is the source in the Torah for the ptur of Tsaras Ereva, we have two roads that we have two descent, we have a difference of opinion. Two different Tanot, two different sources. He says, Binayin leGemara, shemishnasenu soveres kishitas habraisa. There's a brisa that's going to be quoted on Daf Gimel Amid Beis that derives the Ptur of Tsaras Ereva from the word litzar that appears in the parish of Achos Ishto. And from Achos Ishto we derive in a Hekesh all the other aras. Why not? Why not introduce the sheet of Rebbe? On Daf Ches, Rebbe has an entirely different source from which we derive the conclusion that Tsaras Ereva is Ptur ben Ayibum, and that is from the pasuk that it says v'lakcha la leisha, and this is in Parshas Ki Teitzei in the context of Yibum. It says v'lakcha with a hey at the end of the word, and the Gemara says in the name of Rebbe that the letter hey is totally redundant. Midaloksiv v'lakach elokcha darshin kol makom sheish bo shnei likufim. If yochel hayavam lakachas ezim and sheyirtzes shtein mutaros. V'im eino yochel lakachas ela achas miyem shtein asuros. V'lakcha means take her and not her, which means two things. Number one, it means that he could have been the Abnei either one of the two, and that's v'lakcha, choose one of the two. And if, let's say, one of the two was excluded from Yibum, then the mitzvah of v'lakcha of Yibum doesn't go into effect. This is going to teach us, therefore, that if one of the two women that fall for Yibum is an erva, she patters up even Hatsara. Why? Because in the case of Hatsara, the Torah is saying, you have the option of marrying one of these two wives. You choose which one. Lahakim Shem Liachav Ames. You choose one of his wives, one of his almanas. But you have carte blanche to choose one of the other, one of these two. In the case of an erva, you cannot choose the erva, and therefore you can't choose the tsaras erva, because the entire entity and mitzvah of a lakha doesn't apply. The lakha is teaching me a condition in mitzvah yibum, and that condition is that both of them are muteres. And if you don't have a situation in which both of them are muteres and are suitable for yibum, then none of them fall for yibum. Now, if this be the case, according to Rebbe, that we derive the Saras Erva tour from the Lakha, it doesn't indicate any specific Erva of the 15 on the list. There would be no room for the Gemara's catch and objection to the Mishnah. Why did you put Achos Ishto down at the bottom of the list? You should have upgraded her to the top of the list. What are you talking about? We're deriving it from a different parsha, from the Lakha. Has nothing to do with Achos Ishto. Any Erva situation. This is an anonymous, faceless Erva. What we call a joker card. Did I get that right? That you can use a joke card as anything you want? In Scrabble, there's also a blank, I think it's called, no? Where you can use it. What's called? Wild card in Scrabble. So if you have a wild card in Scrabble, you can decide what letter you want to use for it. So that Balakha, you can decide which erva you want to plug in. Whichever it is, it makes it impossible to be Makayim in Mitzvah Yibum. Because as great as the Mitzvah Yibum is, it cannot override any other erva other than Hsad. And now it torpedoes and undermines the Yibum even vis-a-vis Hatsara, because it's not Balakha. You don't have the choice. By process of elimination, you only have one of the two tsaros that you can marry. That's not Yibum. But we're not specifying any particular erva so that we can undermine the sequence as it appears in the Mishnah. Because, as we said, it's a wild card. It applies to all arayos, any of the arayos. Now, before we go on, let's point out that we had a machlokas, if you recall, about whether the B'machlokes Kamairi, B'pluta Kamairi, or B'pluta Lo Kamairi. Did the Mishnah formulate all of its laws in a unanimous agreement? The Pri Megadim is now introducing a dissenting view, a minority opinion of Rebbe, from which we derive the P'tur of Tzaras Erva, from the Lakha. But perhaps our Mishnah wants to satisfy itself according to everyone. According to Rebbe, there's no definite sequence. You can choose any Erva out of the pot. As we said, it's a wild card. But those who rejected Rebbe, the Gemara on Daf Gimel and Beis, they will have one specific Erva from which we derive all the other arayos. And that's Achos Ishto. And that's what the word is objecting about. Why doesn't it, why is Achos Ishto not first on the list? It tirates, so Mishnah Seder Behechrech Lo B'Shitas Rebbe. There's no way that you can reconcile our Mishnah with Rebbe. So for this, we have to learn another Mishnah in Masechet Yevamot on Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis. Here we have a case where two brothers married two sisters, and tragically, they both died without children. And these two sisters now fall for Yibum in front of Levi, the third brother. And the Mishnah says that there's machlokes in this case between the Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon. The Tanakama says, Eino misyamos, ela, Eino choltos vi Eino misyamos, there's no chalitza, and there's no yibum. Reb Shimon disagrees. I'm sorry, let me just say it one more time. That midrabanan, there's no yibum. That's what I meant to say. Reb Shimon sover, sheshtein pturas min hachalitza v'hayibum. V'darash came me litzra. Shebishosh ein nasos saras zula zu bezika. It means when the two brothers, Reuben and Shimon, died, they fall for Yibum in front of Levi. Levi cannot effectuate a marriage relationship with either of these two girls because each one, each one is an Erev, correct? I think that makes sense. שבשושי נאסו סורס לזו בזיקה, כלומר בשושי נופלוס ליבו לפני יובם אחד, לא יהיה לך ליקוחת אף באחס מהם. So again, the bottom line here of this Pri Megadim is to prove that we have a Stam Mishnah that's against Rebbe. Why? Rebbe would certainly exclude Yibum in this case. And the reason for that is because Rebbe derives from the Lakha the possibility of marrying both, or shall we say, either of these two women that fall for Yibum. But that can't be in this case because each one of these two women is an Erev. Of Achos Achiv, of what's the Erev? Oh, I see. I think you have to introduce Zika over here. Let me just see if I'm right. Oh, you see that line? He says, Hare Nasos Soros Zula Zu Bezika. In other words, he has a Zika relationship to both of these sisters, which would make it impossible for him to be miyabim any of the two, because each one of the two is now the sister of his kukalo, of the woman that's kukalo. He has like a Zika relationship, which sets up achos ishto vis-a-vis each one of the two. But the Tanakama says in the Mishnah Daf Chof Ches that hare ein cholzos. That's against Rebbe. You know, he adds the word midrabanan here. That confuses me a little bit. Lo misyamos midrabanan. In other words, for some reason, the Rabbanan said, even according to Tanakam, we're not going to allow Yibum. But on a Deraisa level, it would be Yibum. Haraya, she needs Chalitza. That can't reflect, it cannot be reconciled with the Shita of Rebbe because it's not for Lokcha. Now he says that Rebbe Hadoresh Ptur Tsar Mivolakcha Doreshes Halitzrar Rabbi Shimon. That in this case, where two brothers married two sisters and then they died and they fall for even in front of another brother, we're going to derive from the pasuk Litzrar that there's no Chalitza, there's no Yibum. In any event, the bottom line is that Rav Shimon, let me leave out, Rav Shimon has a drush of Litzrar in a different context of two sisters married to two brothers that fall for even to the third brother. And that drasha of Rav Shimon from Litzrar is accepted by Rebbe. And therefore, the Stam Mishnah that implies that she does fall for Yibum, except on the Drabbana level, they objected to Yibum. And on the Raisa level, she falls for Yibum. That cannot be reconciled with Rebbe because Rebbe, in this case, will agree with Rabbi Shimon that from the extra possible litzor, because again, Rebbe doesn't need the possible litzor for Tzaras Erva, and therefore he's free to accept the drasha of Rabbi Shimon, that litzor tells me that since they are both zkukos to Levi, Levi, therefore they are considered sorrows. That's the extra pasuk, the redundant litzor. So in any event, we have a Stam Mishnah that's against Rebbe, because Rebbe, insofar as he uses the extra pasuk litzor to accept the Joshua of Shimon, would assume that in this case of two sisters, there is no Yibum, and the Mishnah says there is Yibum. Od Hosif, Izeyech lahofiach miguf Mishnah Seimu, Shalok Yeshitas Rebbe Nemr. We're going to find within our Mishnah a proof that this Mishnah rejects Rebbe. Why? Because according to Rebbe, we should add another ptur called achos zikukasa. Like we said before, based on the sugya later on Daf Yutes, we see there's a category called achos zikukasa. In the case with two brothers married two sisters, and if they each have another wife, and they both died without children, then when these women now fall for even to Levi, just like Levi couldn't marry both sisters, he can't marry their tsar. So therefore it comes out that according to Rebbe, there's another, let's call it number 16, an Erev number 16 that should have been added to the list, and that's called Achos Zikukos. But now we want to look at the Netziv in Merome's son. Alpi Divrei Rebbe Lahalon Daf Tes Sheben Pluto Lo Kamayri Volnish Lebishnativ Hashoni Machlokas Tanoim. We said that according to Rebbe, the Mishnah has to be unanimously accepted, and the Gemara asks a kasha based on the Mishnah Daf Chav. Kol Yivam Asur BeIsolat. Choletzes Velo Nisya Bemes. Harry did say Shonim Machlokesu. How can the Mishnah say that if the Yevama is an Isur Lav and not an Isur Kares, is Choletza, she still needs Chalitza, but there's no Yibum. Harei Rabbi Akiva, Chayve Lav Pturim Af Mina Chalitza. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that we upgrade Chayve Lav into the same status as Chayve Krisus, which means that there's no Yibum and there's no Chalitza. So that Mishnah, says the Gemara, is now totally Shonim B'Machlokas. When the Mishnah says the Chayve Lavim is Choletzes, that's against Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva equates Chayve Lavim with Chayve Krisus. There's no need for Chalitza. And the Gemara answers that only in the first parak of Masechet Yevamot, then we apply the principle of universality, right? Of Lo Mishnah Seinu Im Hushanim B'Machlokas. Says that it's let's ask the following question. The Mishnah mentions 15 Noshim Bilvad, Hapochos Es. That's against Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva would hold that even Chayve Lavin pater up that Tzor, which would add a whole new categories, like in Kuhuna, it would be Zona and Chalola, Mamzeres for every Jew. Array Lidvar, according to Rabbi Akiva, we should include in our Mishnah all women who are Suros B'Solah. Ela behechrich, after Rabbi Akiva, poter chayvin lav michalitza lo poter ela osan atzmon. V'lo tzar sein, I imagine. No, you don't have them to use. Aval enom pochos es tzaros sein. So chayvin lav did not pater up that tzaros. Al kein lo nishnu b'mishnah sein. So chayvin lav will let out, or omitted from our Mishnah, because what's counted to all of the arayos, the 15 in our Mishnah, is that they pater up that tzar. Ach lo yitochin lo marken el shitas abraisa shemakar haftur tzara hu militzra v'ein lemedem mizeh el chayve krisis sharai v'lo lechayve lav al kein af l'Rabbi Akiva poter osan atzma ein hein pochos es tzaros seyen aval l'Rebbe Hadoresh ptur tzara mivalakha ein lechalik ben chayve krisis lechayve lavim u'shitas Rabbi Akiva sovesh chayve lavim et cholzos v'syavos yeshlam lifto gam es tzaros seyen shrei af hein bechlal adrosha amura v'kol she'eni yochel lekachas et zu af eino lokech et zu, meaning any erev is included. Even Chavi Lam, according to Rabbi Akiva, in this halacha of halacha, that you have to have the ability to marry both of them. And if one of them is Chavi Lam, then she doesn't fall for Yibum, and she would not pater at Sarah. So therefore, so one second. So Ulashidus Rabbi Akiva, so the Chavi Lam, and Cholzos V'Syavos Yeshlan Ptur Liftars. Oh, on the contrary, I'm sorry. If you derive the ptur of tsaras erva from litzrar, then it has to be similar to achos ishto, and therefore we're going to exclude chayve lav. But if we have that generic, what we call the joker card, right, the wild card of Rebbe, then Allah would be that all those women who are excluded from Yibum would pater up that tsar because of the principle of halakha. Once, according to Rabbi Akiva, you exclude chayve lavim from Yibum, then by definition, if you hold like Rebbe's drush of a lakha, the tzara also is excluded from Yibum, because it's no longer a lakha, meaning you don't have the choice of the two wives. You see clearly that our Mishnah is not operating within the framework of Rebbe. That's the insight of the Netzu. Quite brilliant. So tomorrow, believe it, what we want to set as our goal is really to plow through the entire sugya on the Beis and Beis. Vichti kula me'achos isha yalfinon lisnei achos isha bereisha v'kitema tana chumrei noch. That the Tana wanted to mention the first woman who's more chamura, and this is Chamoso, who's bisreifa, and we're reflecting the Shita Reb Shimon, who holds that sreifa is more chamer than skila. That's our goal for tomorrow. Okay then. So let me wish you a great day.